This episode of Please Explain is sponsored by Aware Super, helping you get more from your future.
From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Chris Payne. It's Thursday, July 13. The government has promised to take on the housing crisis, but many are asking how they will deliver the new housing needed for our cities, and indeed where those new houses might be built. The growing populations in Sydney and Melbourne mean increased attention is being paid to golf courses. They're large, sparsely used pieces of land, often in prime locations. While golf courses look ripe for housing development, green groups and local communities advocate that golf courses become public parks for recreation and to cool the cities. At the same time, golfing groups are fighting hard to keep their greens, upgrade the courses, and to continue playing the sport as they always have. Today, Michael Koziol and Royce Miller on housing, parks, and the golf wars raging in our cities. So guys, full disclosure, I took up golf during the pandemic. I was never a golfer before. I had zero interest in it before that. And now I really love it. So I have a different kind of perspective on all of this now. But I know that not everyone feels the way I do about golf and golf courses and the land it's played on. It's a very divisive issue. So Michael, just to start with you, can you tell me a little bit about the relationship between our cities and golf courses and indeed the people who use those courses?
Well, I think it's almost a town divided among those who golf and those of us who don't play golf and sort of look at these vast swathes of land in our big cities, often in, the city centre in many cases, and sort of say, well, why are we taking up all this public space with golf courses that probably aren't used by that many people in the scheme of things, but take up a huge chunk of space. It's something like in Sydney, about 9% of Crown land is taken up by golf courses. And that's a pretty big chunk. So you can understand why there's sometimes conflict between those two groups of people.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Royce, you wrote a really interesting story in The Age this week. What can you tell us about the Kingswood Country Golf Course in Melbourne and the sort of debate that has sparked?
Well, you're right that there is this sort of split in the community about golfers and non-golfers, and the pandemic really brought that out in Melbourne.
A battle is brewing over the future of a popular golf course at Northcote,
with very, very fiery debates around some of the inner city golf courses, particularly the Northcote golf course, that people started using to recreate on during lockdown. So people ripped down the fence and demanded access to the golf course.
Darebin Council wants to turn it into public land after lockdowns made it a popular picnic spot.
And because of the intense feelings during lockdown, they saw this space that was, in their view, underutilised. It was owned by the local council, and they were saying, why the hell can't we get in there and make use of it ourselves?
But golfers are fighting back.
We are just simply asking council to give us a fair hearing.
The community has just 2 weeks left to have its say on the proposal, with council expected to decide the fate of the...
But the story that you're talking about was probably more in the context of the housing debate. The Andrews government is talking about finally putting an end to urban sprawl in Melbourne. There is a premium on space for building housing within established suburbs, and the Kingswood Golf Course falls into that category. There was a proposal, Australian Super bought that site many years ago actually, with an intention of developing it for 800 dwellings, but ran into massive community opposition from the people in the southeastern suburbs and from local politicians, including the Federal Attorney General actually, whose seat is down there. So nothing happened, and it's a classic case really of, well, it's that not in my backyard thing, but also, hold on a sec, what are we doing with the city, and what do we do in the face of really serious community and political opposition to those sorts of developments? By the way, the Kingswood Golf Course is actually closed. There hasn't been a game played there since 2018. So you have this lovely big open space that's just sitting there, not being accessed, not being used, and not being developed.
Like you said, this story is a significant policy issue. Can you unpack a bit more about why this is so important for the Victorian government?
Well, because of the housing crisis that we're facing, but also the government has committed to, as I said, putting an end to urban sprawl. But we're also facing a huge population increase. So we're talking about finding space for 1 million new dwellings over the next 25 years, I think, more or less, which is a massive challenge. And so we need space to do that. I mean, obviously we're going to go up and no longer out, but up. But also we need space to be building medium density housing. So that's why there's sort of a premium on spaces like this. Similarly, I think the same sort of questions hangs around some of the big old race courses that are locked away and not used for months at a time in fantastic locations. So I think that we're going to see sort of the debate intensify around the use of golf courses, race courses, and other open spaces.
Well, how widespread then is this discussion? There's, plenty of golf courses in Melbourne and in Sydney. Some of those are in financial stress, and as you say, they take up a significant amount of space. How many golf courses could we be talking about here?
Well, there's already quite a few in play, and we know that just in the sort of southeast of Melbourne alone, developers are eyeing off about 20 golf courses, and they're at various stages of action on that. And so what was seen happening over the last decade or so is developers talking to golf clubs saying things like, look, we can find another location for you, a place that's cheaper to run and so on. We'll do you a swap. You'll sell the site. We'll get it rezoned. You'll make a hell of a lot of money. You can move into another site with cashed up. And the golf clubs are saying, well, our numbers are diminishing because while there are still a lot of Victorians playing golf, they're not playing it the way they used to when people had more time. That's just the reality. People don't have the time to go out and play 18 holes of golf. There are fewer people playing golf, 18 holes of golf now than there was 20, 30 years ago. So the golf clubs are saying we're in financial trouble because there aren't, we don't have so many people. The developers are saying we can do you a great deal. And that's putting a lot of pressure on local communities who are opposed to their open spaces being developed.
Talk to me a little bit more about rezoning and why that's a contentious issue, because it's not necessarily as black and white as, okay, well, let's swap a golf course for a bunch of apartment buildings, is it?
No, it isn't. And this is especially the case in Melbourne, where back in the 70s, the Hamer Liberal government set aside what is known as the Green Wedge, or what the Premier at the time used to call the lungs of Melbourne. And that's a big green strip that runs right up through the southeastern suburbs, which is supposed to be put away for open space, for farming actually, and public use. And of course, there's been it's been a very controversial thing over many years because developers have chipped away at the green wedge, and the golf courses tend to be either in or on the edge of the green wedge, and so therefore that adds to the the ferocity of the debate about it, because there's a lot of people who live down there and who are active down there in community groups who say these are the lungs of Melbourne that should never ever be touched. So stay away.
Michael, let's talk about Sydney. This is obviously a huge issue in Sydney as well. But how is it different from Melbourne?
Well, we're also now saying, our new government is saying we've got to build up, not out. So you can expect the same conversations to start happening here. We had one in the last few years around the Moore Park golf course in the city of Sydney. That was a little bit different though, because in that case it was the Lord Mayor Clover Moore saying we want to get rid of half the golf course, not to build houses over it, but basically to turn it into public open space for recreation other than playing golf. And I think Clover Moore's point was, well, we just built this massive high-density development next to Moore Park Golf Course, because it's, if you don't know Sydney, it's right next to the sort of Zetland, Waterloo, Green Square growth area. It's going to be the highest density part of the country. These people need more open space. Let's use, half of this massive golf course that's sitting there right next to it. Now, she's been pushing that barrow for a number of years now. It hasn't gone anywhere. The previous government, state government, intervened and said we don't want this to happen. Even Rob Stokes, who was, a pretty big open space guy, public spaces guy, said that they didn't agree with that. Who knows? The new government may yet take a different view on that, but that's sort of been the main example of an inner city golf course where people have said, hey, let's actually get rid of some of this golf course and use it for another purpose. But I would expect there to be a bit more of that in coming years, especially since, yes, we're now saying exactly the same things about, hey, we need to stop the urban sprawl.
So that's a debate over a public course. Let's talk about the private course to end all private courses in Sydney, which is the Royal Sydney Golf Club, occupies a very, very prime and large bit of real estate in the eastern suburbs. Can you tell us about what's happening there and why that's been coming up in the news more lately?
Well, look, they've done a few things lately, Royal Sydney, and it's, of course, in the golfing world, this is the sort of creme de la creme of courses. It's an 18-hole course right in the middle of Rose Bay. And look, everyone sort of likes to talk about Royal Sydney from time to time because it's always doing something. So, of course, during 2020, it pocketed, I think it was about just under $3 million worth of JobKeeper payments in the first year of COVID, which raised a few eyebrows. It then, during the long lockdown that followed, quite infamously told its members who lived on the North Shore of Sydney across the harbour that, well, you can't drive here because that would take you outside your 5 kilometres. But if you got a water taxi across the harbour, you actually wouldn't be breaking any rules. And then, of course, that became public and caused a bit of a stir. And then sort of the bigger issue has been its sort of golf course redevelopment plan, which is to sort of redo the course and in doing so knock down 600 trees, including some Moreton Bay figs and what have you. And this was a long-running saga in Sydney that the council opposed. A lot of green activists opposed it. A lot of locals opposed it. They didn't want these trees to be knocked down. And that got dragged through the courts for a long time. But late last year, it was essentially resolved during a conciliation conference in the Land and Environment Court and will now go ahead, including the knocking down of the trees. But they're going to plant a bunch more.
And Royce, do you think in 5 years we'll just be having the same conversation we're having now? Or do you think there's going to be more pressure? Because as we've discussed, it does seem to be becoming a more divisive and serious issue in our major cities.
No, I think it is actually quite serious. And the other thing that comes into play, of course, is if we're consolidating Melbourne and Sydney the way that we have to, right, and the way that they're talking about doing to accommodate big population increases, then open space and access to open space is really, really important, right? So if you're going to have high density housing all through the city, people need access to open space. So I think there's going to be more and more pressure on golf courses that aren't being utilised. Of course, it's understandable that people with less money want to have a hit on a public golf course. Of course, I empathise with that. But also, if there's a lot more people living around these golf courses with no access to public space, then you can very much understand why there will be pressure building on governments to reassess whether that is the highest and best use of that space, if you know what I mean, right? I mean, if you've got half a dozen oldies having a hit of golf when there's thousands of others sort of, traipsing around on concrete without access to open space, you have to reassess, I think.
And what do you think, Michael? Do you think we'll see movement on this issue anytime soon, or is it just too divisive for us to see quick action?
I do, mostly because everything takes forever when it comes to planning and development. You've also got a lot of perhaps cashed up, certainly time-rich people who can oppose changes in this area. I mean, if you think about a lot of people who might play golf, often retirees, there's a case dragging on near Parramatta in Sydney at the moment because one of the golf courses out there in Oatlands wants to basically redevelop just a small part of the land that they own to put some seniors housing on it, make a bit of extra money. So they had this deal cooked up with Mirvac for about 155 units. That's been dragged through the courts for a long time now as well because there's a large sort of community opposition to that, including the local MP, Andrew Charlton. So, you can see how any sort of change in this regard would be vehemently opposed and it would take a long time and it would be, appealed and go through all the processes and blah, blah, blah. But maybe we have more conversations about it. I'm sure we will, especially if golf continues to decline in popularity, as it depends on who you ask. But if that does happen and then golf courses and clubs need the money and they're looking to do things, that they're going to have to change to survive. So, I do expect to see more of this, but where it ends, who knows?
Well, Royce, next time you're in Sydney, drop me a line. We'll head out with Michael. I'll show you the sights of Moore Park, beautiful open spaces with a golf club in hand. But in the meantime, thank you both for joining Please Explain.
Not at all.
Thanks a lot.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Margaret Gordon with technical assistance from Dave McMillan. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Chris Payne. This is Please Explain. Thank you for listening.
This episode of Please Explain was brought to you by Aware Super. With super advice and super returns, Aware Super is super helpful. For more information about Aware Super, including their PDS and TMD, visit aware.com.au.